Blood, Money, and Power: How L.B.J. Killed J.F.K. by Barr McClellan. Narrated by Barr McClellan. Copyright 2003 by Barr McClellan. This unabridged audiobook was published by arrangement with Barr McClellan and Hanover House, and was produced in the year 2003 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. This book contains numerous pictures, illustrations, and diagrams that are available on our website at www.tantor.com. Dedicated to Cecile, dearly beloved, always. Self-knowledge is the indispensable prelude to self-control, and self-knowledge for a nation as well as an individual begins with history. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. Introduction. The Texas School Book Depository stands lonely and stark, an ancient red brick building aside the slope framing Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. Almost 500,000 visitors yearly make a pilgrimage to the building's sixth-floor museum, retracing the scene of the death of an American president. The sixth floor itself is both a historic site and a museum, introducing guests to what happened on November 22, 1963. From the windows on the south side, the overlook shows Elm Street and the boulevard where a man's life was instantly destroyed. To the west, the plaza basin is topped with pergolas along a grassy knoll with trees scattered about. The street itself leads to the triple underpass, constructed in 1936, carrying railroad tracks above the traffic arteries. Some years ago, Dallas leaders tried to remove the old building, but the public insisted that a memorial remain. Today, it is the sixth-floor museum. Other floors house municipal offices. The assassination of President Kennedy in that plaza still remains one of the most tragic events of the 20th century. At the time, we were shocked that such a charismatic leader could be killed so quickly and so brutally. The sudden, horrific loss remains with us as an emotional attachment that continues to haunt both our individual memories and our history as a nation. Americans remember what they were doing at the time of the assassination on the same level of recall that was experienced with Pearl Harbor, FDR's death, the landing on the moon, Nixon's resignation and flight, and the terrorist attacks on 9/11. In the ensuing shock, an initial reaction to the killing was fear it was a prelude to a communist attack. The Cold War was at its heights. The Cuban Missile Crisis was still fresh in people's minds. Some even preached the gospel, better red than dead. In the same way, on November 22, 1963, fear of a nuclear war escalated as our armed forces went on maximum alert. The danger worsened as the Lone Nut was identified as a former defector to the Soviet Union and a Cuba sympathizer. Within 2 days, a second Lone Nut carried out a mob-like execution of the first Lone Nut. Major figures associated with organized crime in America immediately fell under suspicion. In the follow-up, however, the hunt for the assassins ended with Jack Ruby's bullet. Some conservative elements in Dallas had given Kennedy a very unpleasant welcome, branding him a traitor for negotiating with the Soviets. That vicious political attack fueled suspicion of a conspiracy involving Big Oil in the city and perhaps other right-wing elements in Texas. The doubts even extended to our new president, Lyndon Johnson, a Texas political leader for 30 years. A Blue Ribbon Commission was appointed to investigate the events in Dallas, with Chief Justice Earl Warren named as chair. Within 9 months, the members reported there had been only one assassin, there was no conspiracy, and improvements were needed in protecting the president. Although conspiracy theories were downplayed by the Warren Commission as rumors and speculation, the suspicions and controversies did not end. In the aftermath of the assassination, politics changed dramatically. In November 1963, Kennedy's progressive programs were mired in congressional infighting. Barry Goldwater, a dedicated conservative, was preparing to run as a traditionalist, promising a showdown over the progressive politics followed since the Great Depression. With the assassination, that equation was gone. Johnson was the moderate to conservative against the staunch conservative. With Kennedy dead, Goldwater's anticipated liberal versus conservative showdown for the voters to decide simply did not happen. In addition, in the shock and the spirit of unity that prevailed after the assassination, Goldwater did not have a chance. He lost decisively in the presidential election that November 1964, only 6 weeks after the Warren Report memorialized the lone assassin theory, creating a lasting icon in our lost president, and awarded Johnson the lingering sympathy vote. Under Johnson's new leadership, important social and civil rights programs were passed. Emboldened by his November 1964 mandate, the new Johnson, now elected in his own right, was driven by the policy of containment to undertake the very controversial Vietnam War. A strange split in American politics resulted. Johnson was hailed by progressive Democrats for his social programs, but rejected by the same group for his war leadership. In a similar policy split, conservative Republicans supported the war, but opposed Johnson's Great Society programs. At first, Johnson admired his great compromise, having guns and butter. However, he gradually changed, despising any opposition, be they activists, liberals, conservatives, or even longtime supporters. As this division hardened with continuing civil rights protests and ever-widening anti-war marches, Johnson's sudden elevation to the presidency was subjected to increasing questions. Some never accepted the loss of Kennedy, and some would never accept leadership from Johnson as a Southerner and a Texan. By the spring of 1968, because of all the opposition, Johnson was literally a prisoner in the White House, and all these elements surrounded and haunted him. He could not work miracles. He could not have guns for Vietnam and butter for his Great Society. Acknowledging his overwhelming problems, he abruptly withdrew from any re-election efforts for 1968. On that evening of March 31, 1968, while some Americans were stunned, many rejoiced. There were few political neutrals during 1968. In the years that followed, Kennedy emerged as a valiant but tragic figure, and Johnson a vilified but also tragic character. The former vice president could never be what his president had been. The emotional shock to the nation had never truly gone away. There simply had been no closure because there was no national consensus that justice had been done. In a very subtle way, for a nation united under one leader, the notion that the king is dead, long live the king, was never accepted. The president is dead, long live the president, never caught on. It lacked both the personalities and the majesty to gain acceptance. The concept that J.F.K. is dead, long live L.B.J., was simply not acceptable. As a nation, we continued to grieve immensely. Perhaps most tragically, Robert Kennedy was driven into a remorseful seclusion from which there was no escape. Jackie Kennedy showed immense strength, but had doubts that remain unanswered. In this overwhelming grief and doubt, most Americans were never able to accept the man identified by the Warren Commission as the only shooter. After all, there were two lone nuts. The evidence and the conclusions just did not fit together. In addition, we could not balance Johnson with what we had lost and the grief we had suffered. We went through the shock and anger and mourning, but there was neither acceptance nor closure. Emotionally, the initial welcome for Johnson was gradually depleted over the 5 years that followed. That shock and the ensuing split in our personal assessment of Johnson lingers to this day. We find ourselves divided between Kennedy and Johnson, between a lone nut killer and a conspiracy, between our inability to have both guns and butter, and with a lingering opposition to the Vietnam War, or full support for that war for containing communism. This conflict combines to leave us as a nation still searching for an answer to what happened. There is no rational explanation for the assassination, and there is no emotional closure for the brutal death. What is needed is to bring these feelings to rest, to undertake an emotional purging, to create a catharsis of the will, and most importantly, to find the solutions to what divides us rationally and emotionally. The many controversies over the Warren Report only make the problem of acceptance more difficult. Using modern techniques for crime scene investigations, numerous researchers have argued every possible theory. Many center on the bullets. First, there is the magic bullet theory, that one bullet hit both the President and Texas Governor John Connally and somehow inflicted massive damage, with no damage whatsoever to the spent missile. The other controversy centers on the fatal bullet, the one with such horrendous consequences, the one that killed the President instantly. Was that bullet fired from behind, from the grassy knoll in front, or from somewhere else? From those bullets, the controversy has literally exploded into so many contradictory ideas that when taken together, they prove everything or nothing. Yet as we know only too well, and as we cannot forget, the horrible and unthinkable did happen. The ridiculous reach of the controversy has divided the nation into two basic camps. One remains convinced there was a conspiracy, involving at the bare minimum more than one shooter. They tend to deride anyone disagreeing with them as an apologist for the Warren Report. The other camp, a shrinking enclave, believes that any person asserting there was more than one assassin is mentally off balance. For many of them, reference to the grassy knoll refers to anyone believing in any conspiracy theories. Such references, this group believes, are cockeyed. They oppose any idea of a conspiracy in government anywhere. At the heart of the debate is an issue that has been with us from the beginning of the American Republic. Patrick Henry argued passionately against a federal system, contending that men would always be selfish, serving personal gain at the expense of the general good. That debate was so intense that the Constitution was approved by the several states with only the slimmest majorities. As we shall see, power initiated the tragedy in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Too often, men in power do what they want, not what the law requires. Turning to a solution to this problem, abuse has occurred often enough to warrant a further expansion of our democratic traditions. Interestingly, what happened in Dealey Plaza remains an event of instant recall. Those remembering that terrible day and the mournful week that followed remain haunted by the basic events. The same remembrance and recall intrigues our younger generations as they learn what happened and then seek to reach their own conclusions. George Matthews is a retired Dallas police officer who routinely leads high school students through the sixth-floor museum. Despite his careful review of what happened and what he knows of the Warren Report, his groups of young visitors remain convinced that there was a conspiracy. Shrugging, he says, "We just never found the evidence." Even though he says he is convinced there was only one shooter, questions linger in his mind. "Just show me," he insists, "or leave it alone." This book will allow us to take an important step toward a necessary resolution, one that will engage both the mind and the heart. To accept what happened, powerful emotions will have to be overcome. Some of these emotions include strong feelings about what happened, feelings now carved in stone. In addition, the raw exercise of power will have to be understood. For this, some may require a suspension of reason, just to believe that a system of laws can become a system of fiat, a government of might over right. Once the system is understood and accepted, however, what led to Johnson's illegal acquisition of power becomes understandable. The assassination was doomed to happen as the night follows the day. And that night did follow the day. Among the many theories about what happened in Dallas, the purpose here is to provide balance, to show how the many interest groups have walked a path that defines the conspiracy. The many researchers who preceded me have made possible the disclosures now made. The issue is not conservative versus liberal, Democrat or Republican, activist or pacifist, reactionary versus radical. The issue is in the nature of power. Simply put, power is the heart of the matter. On the other hand, this book is not a balanced retelling of the life of Lyndon Johnson. There are many excellent biographies about him that restate the public record. Some attempt to provide a balance to show his flaws as well as his achievements. Most rely on information readily available from the public record in Washington and scattered throughout many archives. Some attempt to delve deeper into Johnson's personal life and are commendable for revealing what they witnessed. None goes behind the attorney-client privilege to see what really happened, to show the details of Johnson's personal and business life back in Texas that remains outside the public record and out of sight. In addition, none of the many theories has been able to follow the money from the time political contributions started for Johnson to the acquisition of businesses and properties by Johnson to the bonus finally paid to the chief conspirator. No one has followed this money trail. The assumption by some has been that payoff money was not involved in the assassination. Some apparently assume that many conspirators simply combined to assassinate the president without compensation required. On the other hand, those assuming that the shooters were compensated have never found the money trail. Behind the attorney-client shield in the deep politics of Texas, the most monstrous crime in the nation was planned, completed, covered up, and paid for with power plays that were in place long before and long after November 22, 1963. The roots of the crime rested in that violent cauldron of cold-blooded murders and atrocious lynchings that permeate Texas history. Lyndon Johnson and his personal attorney, Edward Clark, were dedicated to an awful objective based on primal emotions of greed for absolute power, and, particularly in Johnson's case, of a fear that became a stark necessity for survival. Their crimes against our nation were deemed necessary and sufficient by them to protect their very personal sense of superiority and destiny, mixed with a very profound fear of loss of power, one that would be followed by prosecution, by conviction, and by loss of all they had achieved. Particularly for Johnson, for a man in a position to become immortal, the very real threat of eternal condemnation was too much. The combination of these several conflicting motivations proved overwhelming and resulted in the assassination of President Kennedy. How could lawyers be involved? Today many will chuckle as they consider the obvious answer. In 1963, however, lawyers were deemed bastions of truth. They were above reproach, bulletproof. The specific insights into what so-called super lawyers are capable of doing should confirm the suspicions many have about lawyers at the center of power in our democracy. Still, the facts of what happened behind the privilege are not easily disclosed. The few lawyers who were involved have been well paid, and as participants had a vested interest in the execution and cover-up of the most terrible of crimes. In addition, what the few lawyers who were directly involved actually did was known to only a small group of conspirators. Those lawyers committed the crimes by themselves or participated with as few outsiders as possible. It was common sense to keep the crime close, and that secrecy and cover-up succeeded. Until now. The noose around Johnson has gradually tightened. Even today, however, many people remain committed to a belief in Johnson's innocence of any crime, and some are still well paid to defend his heritage to the maximum extent possible. In an almost automatic reaction, they protect the L.B.J. legacy with the best spin possible. There is also a built-in bias against any conspiracy to the extent that the grassy knoll has become an icon to discredit any disbelief in the fundamental soundness of the American system of government. As we shall see, there was a shooter on the grassy knoll, or more precisely, at the fence just beyond it, to the southwest toward the famous triple underpass for Elm, Main, and Commerce Streets. A private citizen seeking to be an investigator into the assassination faces many obstacles, not the least of which is government secrecy and self-protection. By and large, that veil over the assassination has been overcome through the help of countless volunteers. Many of these researchers have assisted me personally. My only requirement was that they stick with me in what I knew was a very difficult task. They have. Through their efforts, the story has become more complete than I ever anticipated would be possible. Even though I found myself at the center of the disclosures about the conspiracy, much had to be unearthed to lay out the extended history, one reaching from the founding of Texas to the present day. In addition, the key elements of the assassination had to be corroborated. There is solid evidence thoroughly implicating Johnson, but the critical print evidence, barely 1 square inch of human sweat, is the final, ultimate corroboration. Thanks also belong to the many independent researchers into the assassination. Their efforts made possible some of the lines of discovery I was given to follow, and they provided substantive threads to several of the key disclosures at the foundation of this book. More important, despite many trying circumstances and a well-organized opposition that would stop at nothing, they kept the investigation alive. An assumption is made that readers will have some understanding of the background to both Johnson's political career and of the assassination of John Kennedy. Because of the new disclosures and the interest generated since our key evidence was presented to the Assassination Records Review Board, this book is only an overview for what happened. One future book will explore far more deeply into Edward Clark's involvement by probing into his Bubba Justice and how it worked in Texas. Dependent on further disclosures by those with the records, perhaps still more detail will emerge about what happened behind the scenes on November 22, 1963. My final volume will suggest the solutions to the government conspiracies that are still possible in Washington, D.C. There are no videos or tape recordings of what Johnson and Clark did in their conspiracy before, on, or after the assassination. Only a few documents show what actually happened. Of necessity, some scenes for what happened will be the journalistic novel, with a carefully marked use of faction. This documentary approach to show the facts will help set out the steps that had to be taken and how and why they were taken. These events are carefully noted in a separate chapter and represent my effort to recapture the events as best as possible based on what I experienced and understood from a unique insider's perspective. In presenting these scenarios, I have also called upon my experience as a trial attorney to present the necessary facts that a jury would hear about what had to have happened. That truth which makes men free is for the most part the truth which men prefer not to hear. Herbert Sebastian Agar. There are many people that have the answers to questions and don't even know the questions exist. J. Harrison, researcher, former Dallas police officer, genealogist. I never saw anything like it. Johnson never trusted anyone. Everybody was after him. Kenneth P. O'Donnell. Chapter 1. Epiphany. Lyndon Johnson ended his days as president on January 20, 1969, when Richard Nixon took the oath of office at noon ceremonies in Washington, D.C. Johnson's reign of power ended. Johnson had lunch with friends that day, then boarded the helicopter for the ride to Andrews Air Force Base and the long flight home to Austin. In the evening darkness, Air Force One landed at Bergstrom Air Force Base, southeast of Austin. Only a small crowd was there to welcome the ex-president. There was no vast turnout of supporting citizens, no parade followed by a dinner banquet, and no welcome home speeches. He did not return the conquering hero. With the Vietnam War still going strong, and with the widespread criticism of Johnson, he had few adoring friends left, even in a city where a majority stood behind him no matter what he did. The small crowd included his key lawyers, a few other die-hard supporters, and those still on his payroll. Austin knew he had failed as president, that the city would never have the income it realized while he was in office, and that the new life he was entering would never be the same. After a few perfunctory waves and handshakes at Bergstrom, Johnson got in a limousine, took the long drive home to his ranch the other side of Johnson City, and began to settle into what remained of his future. The change could not have been greater. From days filled with constant activity and innumerable decisions, from the pressing demands for his time at a job that was 24/7, Johnson suddenly had nothing to do. From the eye of a driving hurricane to a cold, dry, very boring ranch, Johnson had time to think and reminisce, to relive his presidency and all his political years, and to try to develop a schedule for things to do, one that had some life in it. In that stark contrast between constant, controlled chaos and a veritable vacuum, he had no choice but to evaluate his life. He did not like what he saw. Soon after the bitter return, Johnson fell into a deep depression. In that combination of melancholy and listlessness, marked with outbursts of energy and his continuing delusion of the grandeur that could have been, Johnson's paranoia returned, the fear that had first manifested itself shortly after November 22, 1963, when he had become president in those shocking moments in Dealey Plaza. His depression quickly turned severe and long-lasting, presenting itself in a manner that was life-threatening. As visitors came by to see him, their remarks echoed to the same refrain, that Johnson had become totally withdrawn and appeared to have lost his moorings. One adviser remarked, only half in jest, that Johnson was his normal, manic-depressive self. Another development only worsened his melancholy. Johnson was preparing his memoirs. The plan was for 3 volumes, starting with the presidency, then covering the congressional years, and finally reliving his childhood. Interestingly, the program would be perfect for the psychotherapy he would soon begin. Johnson could not write. He would only review what others scripted for him, making notes and adding comments. Each event necessarily triggered memories that might have best been suppressed, because the ongoing confrontation with his complex past only heightened his anxiety, his fear of facing the end of his life, and of having to answer for it. Johnson became still more depressed, and the combination of pessimism, fatigue, and insomnia heightened the continuing fear of another heart attack. Then in May 1970, he suffered severe chest pains and was hospitalized. The diagnosis was angina, and with a heart unable to withstand an operation, nitroglycerin pills were prescribed. He fell still further into a listless state that alternated between grandiosity and paranoia. For the first time, his appearance reflected his condition, as his hair grew long, so much so that he was described as a hippie in those early morning hours at the ranch when he simply refused to groom himself. One of his lawyers remarked that Johnson had become what he had hated. Always able to compartmentalize what he thought, said, and did, to be complex, Johnson now expected visitors to at least condone those complexities, or, more accurately, his peculiarities. He was
Sample complete. Ready to continue?